Alrighty guys, we're going to be reviewing solving equations on this practice test. So I'm going to go over the questions. Let's begin. Question number 1, a very basic one-step equation. How do you solve this? Well, you want to get the x by itself on one side of the equal sign. You don't want this minus 7, so how do you get rid of something? You do the inverse operation. What is the opposite of minus 7 plus 7? And of course, minus 7 plus 7 eliminates. However, if you added 7 to the left side, it got heavier. You need to maintain balance by adding 7 to the right side as well, and that'll bring it back to balance, right? So you got to keep the equality. So what you do to one side, you must do to the other. So there is your answer. The x comes down. 9 plus 7 is equal to 16. So x equals 16 is the correct answer for number 1. Moving on to number 2. It says solve that one-step equation. All right, so let's get x by itself again. You do not want this plus 2. Right? The goal of solving an equation is to get x by itself on one side of the equal sign. So let's get the x by itself on this left side. Let's get rid of this plus 2 by doing the opposite of plus 2, which is a minus 2. What you do to one side, you do to the other side. So what do we have left? We have the x left over. We have the equal sign that comes down, and 11 take away 2 is 9. So there is your answer. X equals 9. Whoops. There it is. X equals 9. Number 3. This is a two-step problem. We have x on the left side of the equal sign. You want to get rid of this minus 1. How do you do that? You do the opposite of, you want to get rid of the plus 1. How do you do that? Do the opposite of plus 1, which is minus 1. And what you do to one side, you must do to the other. So what do we have left? This 1 minus 1 cancels out. We do have a negative x left over, right? That just came down. The equal sign also comes down. So you have negative x equals 5 take away 1 is 4. So on this final step, we want to get the x to be positive. You don't want it to be negative. So we either multiply both sides by negative 1 or divide both sides by negative 1. Either way, it's going to change to a positive x equals a negative 4, right? That's your answer. X equals negative 4. As you can see right here, that's what you must type in. X equals negative 4. Let's move on to the next one. Number 4. Once again, we want to get x by itself on one side, and x is obviously on the left side of this equal sign, but it's not by itself. There's a 4 in front of there, and then there's also a minus in front of the x. That minus belongs to the x. So you want to get rid of this 4. How do you get rid of the 4? By doing the opposite of 4, which is a minus 4. That'll eliminate. What you do to one side, you must do to the other. What do we have left? We have a negative x equaling negative 9. You know what, just to make this a little bit nicer, I'm going to open this up right here, and I'm going to rewrite what I have. I have a negative x equaling a negative 9. Okay. Now, how do I get rid of that negative in front of the x? You could either multiply both sides by negative 1 or divide both sides by negative 1. You could think of it as a negative 1 times x. That way you divide both sides by that negative 1. You're going to end up with x equals positive 9, and that should be your final answer. Let's move this out of the way, and let's see. Answer is x equals positive 9. Number 5, we want to solve for x, and it's 11x equals 55. And what does this really mean, 11x? That means negative 11 times x equals 55. That's what it means. Negative 11 times x equals 55. So how do we get rid of something? You do the inverse operation. What's the inverse operation of multiplying? It's dividing. So you're going to divide by that exact value. This exact value, you're going to divide by it. That way it cancels out. A negative 11 divided by negative 11 is positive 1. So what do we really have? You have a positive 1x. You don't need to put the positive 1. But again, what you do to one side, if you divided by negative 11 over here, if you divided, which we did, by negative 11 over here, you must divide by negative 11 over there, which means that you have x equals negative 5. That's your final answer. Let's check that answer right here. And as you can see, x equals negative 5. That is the answer that we have right there. Let's move on. Number 6. We're going to solve, but this time we have the x on the other side of the equal sign. So as you could see, x is not on the left side, x is on the right side. So it doesn't matter where you get x by itself. Your goal is to get x by itself. right? And these are simple equations. There is no distributive property. There is no combining like terms. So the goal is to get x by itself. You don't want the plus 5. You just want x all by itself on the right side of this equal sign. Okay, so how do you get rid of a plus 5? You do a minus 5. That'll, of course, cancel out. And what you do to one side of the equal sign, you must do to the other side of the equal sign. Negative 3, take away 5, that is negative 8, equaling x. And now that you have x by yourself, that's your actual answer. Of course, the better answer is to write it with the x on the left side and the negative 8 on the right side. There you go. Let's move on. Question number 7 says solve, and once again, the x is on the right side of the equal sign. On the right side of the equal sign. So, I want to get x by itself, so you got to think, what is actually happening on the right side? Does it say 9 plus x? No. Does it say 9 minus x? No. There is no sign between the 9 and the x. That means 9 times x. So if you don't want that multiplication of 9, you got to get rid of it by doing the opposite, which is dividing by 9. And what you do to one side, do to the other side. You will have your equal sign coming down. The 9's canceled out. You have x equals negative 27 divided by 9 is negative 3. So this says negative 3 equals x, which is the correct answer. However, you want to write it with the x term first. So just switch everything. X equals negative 3, and that is your final answer there. Number 8, we're back to a simple equation with the x on the left side of the equal sign. We want to get the x by itself on the left side of that equal sign. You don't want this divided by 6. Technically, you have a fraction. If you don't want a fraction, you could get rid of any fraction by multiplying everything by the denominator of the fraction that you want to get rid of. So if you want to get rid of this fraction, let's multiply that everything by 6. So times 6 times 6. What you do to one side, you must do to the other side. Anyways, when I put the 6 over 6, 6 divided by 6 is 1. That really cancels out. This is your answer. You have the x, you have the equal sign, and negative 2 times 6, that's negative 12. There's your answer, x equals negative 12. That's what we have right here. Type it in like that, no spaces between your terms. Let's move on to the next one. Another simplified equation, but this one has the x back on the right side of the equal sign, okay? So you want to get x by itself, either on the left side or the right side. X is on the right side of this equal sign. Let's get it by itself. It does say x divided by 3. What is the opposite of dividing? It's multiplying. So you're going to multiply by 3. That's going to cancel out. What you do to one side, you must do to the other. You're going to have 3 times 12, which is 36. So what we have here is 36 equals, and what's left over, a negative x. Negative x. So we don't want this x to be negative, we want it to be positive. So you could think of it as having a negative 1 right in front of the x times, right? Negative 1 times x. So how do you get rid of the multiplication of negative 1? You do the opposite, which is dividing by that negative 1 value. So you're going to do that to the other side as well, because what you do to one side, you do to the other side. So you do have the negative 1 divided by negative 1. That cancels out. Your answer will be x all by itself equaling 36 divided by negative 1. That's negative 36. But of course, we're going to write it as x equals negative 36 instead of negative 36 equals x. That's what we have here. X equals negative 36. Let's move on. Number 10. Right here we have what we call a proportion. What is a proportion? Where you have one fraction equaling another fraction, and that's where you could cross multiply, sas, right? Or you could just stick to your what you know already. To getting rid of fractions, you multiply both sides by the denominator of the fraction. And if you have multiple fractions, I recommend going with the bigger one, or thinking about the common denominator. That way it'll get rid of all fractions at the same time. So it's totally up to you. I'll do both methods if you'd like. Cross multiplying 3 times x is 3x. 15 times 2 is 30, and of course you put the equal sign right between them. So again, cross multiplying is where you say this times this equals this times this. And there it is, x times 3, that's 3x. 15 times 2, that's 30, and you put an equal sign between them. Then it's a simple problem to solve. You divide by 3, divide by 3. That becomes x equals 10. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to just get rid of fractions. So let me go back to the original equation. Forget about those red arrows. Pretend they're not there. And let's say you wanted to get rid of this fraction by multiplying by 15. Multiplying by 15, that'll cancel out the 15, and it'll leave you x all by itself. The equal sign comes down. And what you do to one side, you do to the other. You multiply by 15. So think about this. We have 2 times 15 what is 2 times 15? 2 times 15 is 30. And then you have that 30 divided by 3, which will give you the answer 10. So x equals 10. Notice it's the same answer, just done a different way. When I have proportions, one fraction equaling another fraction, I always think cross multiply. X times 3 is 3x. 15 times 2 is 30. Put the equal sign between them, solve this simple one-step equation, you get x equals 10. But then again, if you see fractions and you want to get rid of fractions, you could multiply both sides or multiply everything by the denominator of the fraction that you want to get rid of, in this case 15, and everything else cancels out as well. Alrighty, let's move on. We finally get to some more interesting, they're still simplified. There's still no distributive property or combining like terms, but let's get started on this. You want to get x by itself on one side of the equal sign. X is clearly on the left side. It's not by itself. So we want to get rid of this minus 3 first, right? Why is that? Because x is what's important. This fraction's with the x, it's kind of important. This number is all by itself. It's the loner. Let's get rid of this guy, right? So how do you get rid of that 3? You do the opposite of positive 3, which is a negative 3 or a minus 3. And what you do to one side, you do to the other side to maintain the equality. What I'm going to do right now is cover this up and show my work on here. So what do I have left? I have a negative 1/5 x equaling 1 take away 3 is negative 2. Now at this point you want to get rid of this fraction, and we should know by now that to get rid of a fraction you multiply everything by the denominator of the fraction that you want to get rid of. So you do have the option of multiplying by 5 both sides, but if you just multiply by 5, like if you put a times 5 right here and a times 5 over there, it's not gonna, it'll get rid of the 5, but it won't get rid of the minus sign. So if you want to kill two birds with one stone, if you want to get rid of both the divided by 5 and the negative sign, don't just multiply by that number, but multiply by negative 5. Okay, so let's do that. Let's put a negative 5 right there and make this a negative 5 as well, because if you multiply by negative 5 on the left side, you have to multiply by negative 5 on the right side. Anyhow, what happens is that the 5 cancels with the 5, and then the negative times a negative will give you a positive. So you have a positive 1x, which is just x, equaling a negative 2 times a negative 5, that's a positive 10, and that is our answer. X equals positive 10. That's what we have here. Moving on. Number 12, we are going to solve another 2 or 3 step equation, depends on how you look at it. It's still simplified. There is no distributive property, no combining like terms. So we're going to begin with, where's x at? X is on the left side of the equal sign. It's over here. The goal is to get x by itself. So you don't want the plus 2 and you don't want the fraction 2/3. What do you get rid of first? The 2/3? I mean, you could if you wanted to, but I highly recommend to think x is what's important. The 2/3 is with the x. It's kind of important. Let's get rid of this 2 that's all by itself. After all, it's really easy to get rid of a plus 2. You simply do a minus 2. And what you do to one side, you do to the other side. So what do we have left here? Let me create more space. We have a 2/3. Let me write that down. 2/3 x equals, right, the equal sign came down, negative 4 take away 2, that's negative 6. And that's our new equation. Now we need to get rid of this fraction 2/3. And how do you get rid of a fraction? You multiply both sides by the denominator of the fraction you want to get rid of. Actually, multiply everything by the denominator of the fraction that you want to get rid of. So what happens here is that the 3's cancel out. I have a 2x left over, equals comes down, negative 6 times 3 is negative 18. So the final step here would be to get rid of that multiplication of 2 right in front of the x. And how do I get rid of the multiplication of 2? I divide by 2. And what I do to one side, I do to the other side, divide by 2, giving us our final answer, x equals negative 9. That's our final answer. As you could see, that's the answer that we must type in with no spaces between our terms, x equals negative 9. Let's move on. Number 13, we have another 2-step equation, very straightforward, very simple. 2x plus 3 equals 7. So I want to get rid of the plus 3 and I want to get rid of the 2. Which one do I get rid of first? I get rid of the plus 3 first. Why is that? Because x is what's important. 2 is with the x. It's kind of important. This guy is all by himself. Let's get rid of this guy. Right? So let's get rid of that plus 3 by subtracting 3. What I do to one side, I do to the other side. What's my new equation? I have a 2x left over. I have the equal sign that comes down, and 7 take away 3 is 4. So what do I really have here? I have 2 times x equals 4. I don't want that multiplication of 2 in front of the x. I want x all by itself. After all, that's the goal of solving any equation. So I divide by 2, I divide by 2. That will give us x equals 4 divided by 2 is 2. Type that in with no spaces between your terms and you will get full credit. So on this equation, we have the x on the right side of the equal sign. You don't want the x by it. I mean, you want the x by itself. You don't want the minus 5 and you don't want the minus 15. So the goal is to isolate the x. You don't want this minus 15. So we're going to do the opposite of minus 15, which is plus 15 and plus 15. Okay, and that ends up eliminating over here too. So what do I have left on the left side? Nothing. I bring down the equal sign. I bring down the 5 times x. And how do you get rid of that multiplication of negative 5 in front of the x? You divide by negative 5, divide by negative 5. And some people might think that this is undefined or something like that, but it's totally natural to have a number 0 divided by something. What is 0 divided by anything? 0. It's 0. So 0 equals x, x equals 0 is the correct answer to this problem. So on this question, we do have x on the left side of the equal sign. It's definitely not by itself. You want to get rid of the minus 2 and the minus 8. Question is, which one do you get rid of first? You get rid of the minus 8 first. So how do you get rid of something? You do the opposite. The opposite of minus 8 is plus 8. That will eliminate. And what you do to one side, you do to the other side, plus 8. So what do we have? We have the equal sign that comes down. On the left side of the equal sign, we have the negative 2x that comes down, right? That's the only thing left because these guys cancel out. That comes down. Equal sign comes down. And if you owe 20 and you have 8, you are still going to owe 12. So your new simplified one-step equation is negative 2 times x equals negative 12. And again, that is a negative 2 times x. And you don't want that multiplication of negative 2 in front of the x. So you get rid of that multiplication by dividing by that exact value, negative 2. Okay? And that'll eliminate, and then you'll get x equals a negative divided by a negative is a positive. X equals positive 6. So I hope everybody understands that. On this question right here, yes, x is on the right side instead of the left side of the equal sign. X is by itself, but it has a negative sign in front of it, right? You don't want a negative x, you want a positive x. So you could either multiply both sides by negative 1, or you could divide both sides by negative 1. Like technically there's a negative 1 times x right in front of there. So if you divide by negative 1 and divide by negative 1, then technically you get x equals positive 2/3. And that's the answer. It's that simple, just changing the signs. On this question, it reads, your goal is the process, or the goal, I can't even read right now, I'm sorry. Your goal in the process of solving an equation is the goal is to get x by itself. That's what isolate means, to get x by itself, isolate the variable on one side of the equal sign. It's not, that's the answer. It's not to cancel things out. That's the process of getting x by itself. It's not to get rid of multiplication with division. You might have to do that when you're getting x by itself. It's not getting rid of addition with subtraction. You might have to do that when you're solving. On this question, it reads, the first step to solving an equation is, the first thing you should do is not think about the overall goal to get x by itself. That's not what you should do. You got to check and see if you could actually make it more simple. Is there any distributive property? Is there any combining like terms? So the correct answer is, in this case, simplify. Simplify the equation if possible. That means do distributive property and or combining like terms.